This video is intended to help students work on the research assignment. In a way, it's meant to give a rationale for why research is taught the way it is in college. It's intended to help answer common problems that I see cropping up in my classes and to help you in the long term for when you get into other classes that do require research. The larger purpose here is to help you understand what your instructors expect of you and what's more commonly expected of research and the goals of research. Alright, so here we go. The problems that I have seen, or that I used to see before I started teaching research assignments this way, was that I'd get students come into class and they'd say things like, well, I heard it somewhere, well, I just believe that can't be true, or I believe this can be true or should be true, or Jon Stewart said so, no offense to the Comedy Central fans. I'd get students retelling some information that they'd heard from some vague entity, but not knowing really what a source is. And of course, we're not going to be accepting Google, no Wikipedia, no wikis really for a research assignment, because I can't pass you on to the next class and say, well, I've taught them good research, and then really just sort of allow any old thing. Because I think it bears repetition that the sources that you choose do reflect and build greater things for your research assignment. Just as with cooking, if you start with bad ingredients, you're not going to get a good result. I'd have students quoting huge chunks of unacknowledged material, and usually what would happen would be that they'd copy and paste some website and then add a couple of sentences, perhaps before, maybe after, but really it was, by and large, they're not their writing. And while that probably doesn't affect everyone in class, it does affect so many students that I thought I'd address it, that we're not just asking you to produce a collage of other people's writing. The sources I would get sometimes would be fast, easy, free, and often unauthoritative, and that presents a problem. So really what we're studying when we study the research assignment is we're studying the very essence of authority itself. What builds our authority, what builds the authority in our sources. Students choosing topics that their older brother once wrote an essay on because they can recycle a paper for another class, they say, well, I just don't know why I chose this one, it just did, and usually it'd be the fast and easy source, and that's not necessarily the best source. As you know from good experience, if it's fast and easy, it might not be the best thing for you. Now, what I'm trying to see now in my assignments and the assignment that I give for research is that we discovered that the source itself is worthy of our time on this topic. It's as if we're creating a little argument to ourselves about why this source really helps us. It helps us because, in which we see here, the idea is that we see something in the source that really adds to the research goal and project that we're embarked upon. Not just because it's in front of us, but because it's in front of us and it has something. It has something to contribute. Usually more than just sort of an opinion that agrees with us, too. And here's the key point. Sources have authors. We ought to be able to identify who is the author, who is the person speaking or writing this source. If we don't find an author, if we have difficulty finding an author, that should trouble us a little bit. Sometimes I'll get students coming to the citation page of their document and they'll discover that they're missing authorial information, so they'll write me and I say, well, wait a minute, why does it miss an author? The students really sometimes just want to fill in the citation, be done with it, but of course what it reveals sometimes is that the student has picked up something that's a blog or a wiki that's unauthoritative because there is no author who's willing to take credit or responsibility for what they printed. That's a problem, and if you don't see why that's a problem, you're going to have to talk to me. Somebody has to be responsible for what the information is that's there, and even if it's a group author, say the Red Cross or maybe a government document, somebody wrote it. Words show that someone's behind the words, and that is something we ought to investigate further and make a little argument to ourselves that that's important. And then the last point here, quotes should be used sparingly, strategically, and appropriately. That's as opposed to as a huge block or chunk of information that's imported into someone's paper that really dominates the paper, maybe makes up more than 60 or 70% of the paper. Instead of using those quotes like that, not really presenting our writing, what we're trying to encourage in a research assignment class is the use of quotes that is used sparingly, so we know which quotes are the most important, which ones are highlighted because of the language that's involved. Strategically, we use them for a reason, and that we use them appropriately as if they're integrated into our paper and we know how they fit in and we've explained it through the course of the paper. all of which we demonstrate in class and see examples of in class, so be sure to attend. What I used to see back in the old days, teaching research assignments, and what I sometimes still see, I'll get students saying, well, I went out and found some sources, but they're newspaper articles from the Duluth newspaper. This was a student who happened to be writing on endangered species and the wolf hunt that was recently started up again a couple of years ago. She wanted to write about hunting of wolves in northern Minnesota, and she found a couple of articles, one an editorial from the Duluth newspaper, and they weren't even aware that it was an editorial and that it was going to be opinionated and have a bias. So she called it biased without actually investigating why it was biased in the first place. Editorials are editorials. If you don't know what they are, ask. They're all over the place, and sometimes they're authoritative and sometimes not. I didn't think that was enough research, really. I said, and here we're skipping over to the right-hand column, what about a report on endangered species to set some context and give background for wolves and maybe animals more generally, or why the endangered species laws exist and really do apply to Minnesota. It's funny because within a few seconds I was able to find some larger context sources that were able to talk more broadly about what was going on with the hunt itself, and that really did help her in the long run. But she wasn't thinking in those terms. She thought, well, I'll just quickly cobble together a couple of sources, and who cares that they come from the same source and that I don't know what they are. Or, of course, what I used to see and still see now is people just Googling it. And the point is that you want to see, if you're a real student, different kinds of sources. Sources that may not be covered by Google. Remember, as I said in class, Google by its own admission covers less than, and searches less than 1% of everything out on the web. Well, what's in that 99%? You should be able to find and be interested in other sources that are not ones that are just easily found on Google. Okay, you're in college after all. That's one of the goals of college, to see sources that you may not have thought you were interested in, or that are off the beaten path. Let's take that road less traveled and find the sources that are off the Google map. Or I'd get students responding and saying, I'm over on the left-hand column now, he is so biased, or this source is so biased, here he comes with his biases and biased sources. But the students who are in my class or in college usually are ready for college sources. It may be biased. That's all right. I'm biased in favor of good writing and good source finding. I really don't help anyone out by saying sources are less important than just people spouting off, here comes a bias I agree with, here comes a bias I don't agree with. Remember that word bias has become so malleable it doesn't really mean anything, except that it usually means that the thing I'm reading has an opinion and I may not agree with it. Or if it's unbiased, we think it's an opinion that we do agree with, or that's fact. And that's a problem. That deals with the assumptions that we have when we approach sources. Can you see why that's a problem? I hope you do. You'll encounter bias. Sometimes the bias is to help their readers understand more about the problem, and that's not a bad bias at all. In some of the sources that I recommend, they actually try to talk about as many biases as they can, not just one or two. They try to embrace the biases. So we don't shy away from the word bias if it means opinion, or the different informed opinions that are on a subject. Let's figure out what makes those opinions informed or not. Okay. The bottom line for dealing with sources, at least for the rationale for why I assign the assignments that I do, is here. We should know something about our sources. Everybody should know something about the sources where they get their information. We should know, not everything in the world, but at least something about how long they've studied the subject, or what they know about it, or where they come from, or how they come at their subject, what their perspective is. We should know something about our source. It shouldn't be a fly-by-night, or just barely noticed, who is this person, why do they have anything to say to me, or not knowing that someone wrote it at all. It should be a case where we know something about our sources. We can say that they're authoritative, they're worth our time. We should understand why it's important to know something about our sources. That really seems really convoluted, but I'm hoping through videos like this and through our work in class to understand that it's more than just an exercise of kind of going through the motions. That what I'm trying to teach is that starting with the sources that we gather together, we have to start thinking in terms of, well, this is valuable because, and making little arguments to ourselves to understand why some sources will serve us better than others, and why some of our research work for this paper, and yes, more largely for the class and for our work at college, why some of the sources deserve more of our attention, why they're giving us more, what their worth is to us. Okay, that should make sense, I think, to most people with that little convoluted writing there, and it's meant just to convey that we should understand why we're doing what we're doing, and that will give us more inspiration, I think, to do it well, more motivation to do it well. And then lastly, this will be covered both in class and in other videos, we should know the basic procedures for locating good sources and describing them. Describing should be old hat by now because we're describing all sorts of things. It's part of our assignments. But locating them, of course, we're going through the very procedures which might be off the Google path, and yet it won't be that hard. And we can do it off campus to find and locate sources which will help us for our work.